Good morning, good morning and good afternoon to those in the East Coast. I'm Dr. ElHessen. I'm a commissioner with the Commission on the California Commission on Disability Access. And I also chair the Education and Outreach Committee. And I want to thank you all sincerely from the bottom of my heart for joining us for our Driving Progress, the ADA and the Evolution of Inclusion. This session is being recorded. The California Commission on Disability Access and the Statewide Independent Living Council of Georgia are excited to have you here for a screening of the documentary Inclusion, the Story of the Americans with Disabilities Act, followed by a live panel discussion with a few panelists from the film. Today, we take you through the progress of the ADA and the evolution of inclusion. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce the coordinator of this program, Presley Baker-Strother. She's a marketing and outreach analyst for our commission. And I'm going to have her go through the housekeeping. I'll turn it over to you, Presley.
Thank you, Commissioner Dr. ElHessen. I will start with the housekeeping. So please remember to keep your audio muted during the webinar. Please use the Q&A feature to post questions, and the chat feature can be distracting for people with vision disabilities who read screen readers. For the Zoom viewing options, in the upper right-hand corner, select View. For speaker or gallery views with the screen share, you can either put standard or side-by-side options. During the PowerPoint, the View option menu at the top of the screen you can use to adjust the ratio and other features. During the PowerPoint, you can also use the slider for the shared screen and the participants that we have. For our Zoom live captions, we do have captioners here today, so thank you for being here. To turn on your captions by selecting the CC icon, Show Captions on the menu bar. You can change the size of the captions by selecting the up arrow next to CC and choose the caption settings. And then you can also move the captions hovering to your preferred location. If you'd like to turn them off, use the Caption CC icon to hide captions. We also have a Stream Text Live link that you can find in the chat for other captions. We will have a Q&A session at the end after the video. If you would like to, please make sure to put all your questions in the Q&A. To ask a question, select the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. A box shown to the left will pop up just like this, and your questions you can enter throughout the webinar. At the Q&A session at the end of the presentation, selected questions will be answered. We will do our best with the matter of time that we have. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone once again for being here today, and I will pass it back to Commissioner Dr. ElHessen.
Thank you so much, Presley. So at this point, I'd like to begin the introduction of our panel. And following the screening of the documentary Inclusion, the Story of the Americans with Disabilities Act, throughout the film, we will pause to hear our panelists who will share reflections and insights to key moments in the story of the ADA. As a moderator, I will lead the discussions with questions focused on events from the film. Myself, I have a disability. I have a physical disability. I'm post-polio. And I've gone through the windmills training on ADA. So this is very close and dear to my heart in regards to creating equity and inclusion. So right now, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We're honored to welcome the Executive Director of the State Independent Living Council of Georgia, Shelly Simmons. Shelly, would you like to just briefly introduce yourself and give us a brief background?
Good afternoon or good morning for some of you. Again, my name is Shelly Simmons. I am the Executive Director of the Statewide Independent Living Council of Georgia, what we refer to as SILC. And SILC is a federally mandated organization. So every state and territory has a SILC office. So we have 56 of them nationwide. I too am an individual with a disability, physical disability. I have limb girdle muscular dystrophy. For some of you older people, I am one of Jerry's kids, but we put together this short documentary to recognize the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was about 4 years ago. And so we're excited to be working with the CCDA and helping spread this information. Hope that you will enjoy it and hope that it sparks some good conversations. Thank you, Dr. Sue.
Thank you, Shelly. Appreciate that. We then have the Executive Director of the National Federation of the Blind, Anil Lewis.
Hi.
Anil, welcome.
It's my pleasure.
Can you please give us a brief background and of yourself?
Sure. I'm Anil Lewis. I'm the Executive Director of Blindness Initiatives for the National Federation of the Blind. We're a nationwide organization of blind people. We have affiliates in all 50 states, District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. An organization that knows that blindness is not the characteristic that defines you or your future. And every day we seek to raise expectations for blind people because we realize it's those low expectations that create obstacles between blind people and our dreams. I'm a blind person myself, lost my sight back in 1989, and I'm very pleased to be here with you. Well, for me this afternoon, for West Coast this morning still.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here. We then have the independent living specialist and community organizer, Jordan Hall. Jordan, if you can briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about you.
Everyone, I am Jordan Hall. I am the Mobility Policy Coordinator for the Statewide Independent Living Council. I'm also a power wheelchair user. I live with cerebral palsy, and this documentary was just so important to us, and it is so important to us. And we're very thankful for the ADA, but we also recognize that there needs to be an extension of mobility towards a more inclusive world. And so we hope that discussions and panels like this will definitely foster growth and increase visibility for our community.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jordan. Our next panelist is Parker Glick, and I know he's an advocate for disability rights. I'm not sure if we were able to connect. I know he was having technical difficulties. So I don't think he's on yet. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to our panelist, April Dawson. Excuse me. Sorry, April. April Rawlings Dawson. And she is our executive director for the CCDA. And I know she was having some difficulty with her throat today, so I'm not sure if she wants to do the brief introduction, or we also have Phil McCall available to support, who's our operations manager.
Thank you, Commissioner Dr. ElHessen. This is April, and Phil is my standby voice. I apologize, I have a cold today. But the California Commission on Disability Access was founded by the California State Legislature in 2009, and we focus on spreading access throughout California to businesses. And so we work with business stakeholders as well as people with disabilities and local municipalities to ensure access to businesses across California. And I want to welcome all of you to this screening today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Thank you, Commissioner Dr. ElHessen, for moderating, and to all of our panelists. And I'm really looking forward to learning more from all of you today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, April. Thank you all for being here, and I welcome our panelists. Please remember to post any questions you may have in the question and answer. There'll be a short question and answer session after each segment of the documentary that we're going to be highlighting. Our first one is going to be on exclusion. Before we start the film on inclusion, the story of the Americans with Disabilities Act, I want to take a moment to reflect on why the story is so significant. This documentary captures the long and tireless journey of advocates who pushed for the Americans with Disabilities Act, a landmark that transformed the rights and access for 61 million Americans with disabilities to date. I also want to mention that this is the second largest Civil Rights Act passed since 1964. As we watch the film, our panelists, some of whom were directly involved in these efforts, will share their perceptions of the ADA legacy and its ongoing impact. So let's begin the journey together, and I'll invite you to consider the powerful message of inclusion and equity rights that the ADA represents for all of us. So our first segment is going to be on exclusion.
Kate Gaynor, grassroots activist, speaks in voiceover.
It was a day unlike any other day.
March 1990. A black and white photograph shows a woman holding a sign that reads, "Everybody needs equal access."
There was a call for a march from the White House to the Capitol. It was over 4,000 people, the majority of people in wheelchairs. And we were all the way down Pennsylvania Avenue. I was near the front, so looking back, it was amazing.
Ignited by the power of civil disobedience, the once stalled bill passes and can now become law. The timeline indicates Capitol Crawl, March 12, 1990.
After a day of speeches, over 60 activists abandoned their chairs and began crawling up the 83 stone steps of the Capitol.
Statewide Independent Living Council of Georgia, documentary films.
For many congressmen, the sight was disturbing. They reacted in anger, furious at the visibility of the protesters' disability, and furious because they knew of no other way to react to the sudden unmasking in broad daylight of communities that had for too long been hidden away.
It is the purpose of this act
to ensure
that
the federal government plays a central role in enforcing the standards established in this act.
Took a bold step towards righting that wrong, but the stark fact remained that people with disabilities were still victims of segregation and discrimination, and this was intolerable. And today's legislation brings us closer to that day when no Americans will ever again be deprived of their basic guarantee of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Inclusion, the story of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Text reads, exclusion, denying someone access to or bar someone from a place, group, or privilege. Text appears over the Capitol building steps, Washington, D.C. Mark Johnson, founder of ADAPT, speaks.
I helped form a group called ADAPT in 1983, and ADAPT became known as the group that was willing to use civil disobedience, or direct action, civil disobedience when needed. So when we went to D.C. in 1990, the bill was stalled in the House. You know, the Senate had already passed it, and the bill was stalled in the House. So we organized a march. We got in front of the east and west side of the Capitol, and at the count of three, those who could get out of their chairs did, and they crawled up the steps to just demonstrate what our daily lives are when there's barriers, when there's lack of access, when there are not lifts on buses, or. What a lot of people don't know is the day later we took over the United States Capitol, and over 100 people got arrested in the U.S. Capitol. So there was the march, there was the crawl, which, has this folklore about it because it's so visual. And then the next day there was actually the occupation of the U.S. Capitol.
Shayla Sawyer, grassroots activist, speaks over footage from the occupation.
It was frightening. Some of us were frightened because I had never been arrested before in my life until I actually got arrested the first time. You wouldn't know of the fight in terms of what things we had to do and how much of those things we had to do. So I think the message mostly is in the process, the things we had to go through and what the outcomes were. Yeah, they were productive, they were positive, they were reinforcing They sent a message, but sometimes, we got hurt, and we had to go through that and live with that. But those are our battle scars.
Text reads, Washington, D.C. Kelly Buckland, former executive director of the National Council on Independent Living, speaks.
So I lived with a disability for 20 years before the bill was made law, so I'm very familiar with what things were like beforehand. Well, there were no ramps, there were no curb cuts. Basically, if you wanted to get somewhere, you had to find a driveway to get back up on the sidewalk. Most buildings were inaccessible, you couldn't get into them. Even places that you could get into, a lot of times you would be kicked out. Didn't used to be allowed to go to like movies because you had to sit in the aisle, and they all considered that like a fire hazard. So that's what they said anyway. I think they just didn't want you in the aisle. So they would make you leave. Obviously employment was a problem because people could discriminate openly. Just tell you that they didn't hire handicapped people. That's what they used to call you, as handicapped. So even the language has changed over the years, and a lot of that's due to the bill.
A sign outside of the Capitol building indicates accessible parking. Footage shows Judy Heumann addressing Congress in 1984.
Experience has taught us that we must be constantly aware of people's attempts to discriminate against us. We must be prepared at every moment to fight this discrimination. The average American is not, nor should they have to be prepared to fight every day of their life for basic civil rights.
Judy Heumann, board member of the Disability Rights Education Defense Fund.
I was very involved in a number of pieces of legislation, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and a very important provision of a law called Section 504, which prohibits discrimination against a disabled person with a program that's getting money from the federal government.
As she speaks, images show her protesting in 1973 and alongside Justin Dart, father of the ADA, Patricia Wright, the general, and Ed Roberts, father of independent living.
I was involved with people like Justin Dart, Pat Wright, and other people as we were moving forward to develop the Americans with Disabilities Act to ensure that basically disabled people were going to get the same protections as the Civil Rights Act provided for people from racially diverse communities. In 1964, it took us till 1990 to be able to get an equivalent law. When we look at any of the civil rights laws, and the Americans with Disabilities is in that family, the reason why these laws are important is because people have been separated within communities. They've been treated as second and third class citizens, and these laws are intended to remedy this.
And that would empower innocent. We let the politicians know that they weren't going to stop us from getting ADA.
President George H.W. Bush speaks at the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990.
Which has, for too many generations, separated Americans with disabilities from the freedom they could glimpse, but not grasp. And once again, we rejoice as this barrier falls, proclaiming together, we will not accept, we will not excuse, we will not tolerate discrimination in America. On your behalf, as well as the behalf of this entire country, I now lift my pen to sign this Americans with Disability Act and say, let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down. God bless you all.
In 1994, the ADA finally goes into effect. In 2008, President George W. Bush signs the ADA Amendments Act, allowing for broader protections against discrimination. Meanwhile, more than 30 years after its passage, the ADA's promise to people with disabilities has yet to be realized. Ali Stroker, Tony Award-winning actress, speaks.
For me, that language is almost poetic. And it's a beautiful image, but it's not reality. These walls that will come crumbling down, it's not just I'm gonna push a button and things are gonna be solved. It's only been 30 years. The problems are not all solved. Just take a walk down in the village of New York City. It's It's a mess down there. It's not accessible. So the thing is that it affects people with disabilities, but it really affects the people who are not disabled, who need to change their way of life, not for themselves, but for a community who needs them.
Text reads, segregation.
Thank you. All right, so at this point, I wanted to see if we had any questions from our panelists in regards to what we just seen, any insights from where we are now.
This is Neil. I have something to offer. So I love that we're starting with exclusion. And just to disclose, I'm an African American male. So I have kind of an intersectional existence, a lived experience between being Black and having a disability. Matter of fact, I was born in 1964, so I'm a product of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And as I said earlier, I was blind in 1989, so I'm a product of the ADA. Really thankful that there were people who did the struggle. I think that this particular piece of the film kind of frames it in the context of the discrimination that's uniquely faced by people with disabilities. The whole Capitol crawl was really that time when we changed the narrative, right? Because unlike other types of discrimination, people with disabilities are discriminated in a different way. It's not necessarily through hate. It's more through love and that kind of custodialistic attitude. So I really believe that there are a lot of people that then and still today, because that's still a struggle we have to fight, don't feel there's discrimination. They think that it's their responsibility, some moral responsibility to take care of us, those less fortunate. So the Capitol crawl was really kind of the Edmund Pettus Bridge of disability, right? It changed the narrative in the public eye that no, these are people who really want to live, and they are being unfairly discriminated against, specifically in that instance around, physical access to structure. So I really love the fact that exclusion is one thing. And the other thing I'd highlight, well, I'll wait because I'm going to skip ahead to another section, but I do think that once that society started realizing that we felt we're being excluded, then we're able to get more traction with respect to the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act.
Thank you. Thank you. Neil. Any other comments?
I also would just add that for me, a lot of the barriers that we face are largely due to infrastructure as well, and the way the infrastructure is created. We talked about ramps and sidewalks. We still have sidewalks that consistently are under construction that limit the accessibility. That something that I think some people consider taboo is talking about, okay, great, I have access to a building, but once I'm in the building, is the building that I'm entering, does it have bars in the restroom? Because for me as a wheelchair user, if I don't have a bar in the restroom, I can't use that restroom. And another thing that comes to mind is that if you look at a highlight of this video, which is very empowering and good, but most of the disability advocates that are being featured in this video, their allies in this were also fellow members of the disability community. I think in order for inclusion to be as integrated as possible, our able-bodied community members need to have the visibility that our fellow disability community members have. For example, the reason that we were so empowered for this movement is because we believed what we were capable of. We believed in our potential to be productive, useful, hardworking members of society. And I think that that facet of our character needs to be exemplified and provided to all community members, disabled or our non-disabled counterparts as well.
Yes, I have to agree with you. The question is, what are some related issues related to exclusion that still need to be resolved, especially in public spaces? And I still see that we do have many architectural barriers that you mentioned, Jordan, as well as you and Elle, in regards to, I think our architects need to really, when you're designing buildings, really keep the universal design, which we'll talk about that, a little bit later. But as far as public spaces, I know that with CCDA, we just put out our public parking campaign where we're trying to really educate businesses as well as architects and developers on developing spaces to at least park and get to a building. But you're right, the next step is once you get in that building, how are things going to be able for us to maneuver and access, for it to be more accessible? Another question that came up for us to consider is Kelly Buckland explains how before the ADA accessibility was almost non-existent, and people with disabilities were even excluded from places like movie theaters. So how much progress do you believe has been made since then in ensuring equal access? And I'll open it up to any panelists who'd like to chime in.
We're at like a 60% maybe of like increasing inclusion and decreasing exclusion. I also think it's kind of poetic that the example used in the video was movie theaters, because now certain movie theaters not only have accessible seatings, but they also provide free tickets for individuals with disabilities or individuals that are their companion in the movies. So that is an example of a drastic change. But I just think that even in that, there's so many levels to gaining access to something. I'm seeing in the I just saw in the comments somebody posted, something that is not being said is that a lot of individuals with disabilities are still in their homes just watching TV. And to that, I would say that is something too. For me, when I think about access, the building block to access is transportation and being able to accessibly travel to destinations within your community that are not only accessible, but the methods of transit need to be cost effective as well. Currently, there's just such a high cost to accessible transportation depending on the state that you're in. I know California, you guys are really making strides in terms of accessible transportation. But when we talk about our state, specifically Georgia, in the rural areas, the only transit providers are sometimes non-emergency medical transportation providers, which can only take people to and from medical appointments. And our lives are so much more than making our medical appointments. So.
Absolutely.
Yes, I like.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Anil.
No, I just want to offer in response to the question of, how much progress have we made? I think we have made progress. I mean, with respect to, you have individuals, even with architectural barriers, that pride themselves on creating fully physically accessible places, which I think should be highlighted and continue to become more and more the mainstream. You have standards and guidance on how to make it happen, because a lot of times it was done, or accessibility barriers were put in place because of the lack of knowledge of how to make things accessible. So I think that to that degree, we've made some progress. I think that one of the things that'll probably be a reoccurring theme throughout this discussion is we think that there's a terminus, right, where it's done. But the only way that's going to be possible is if the world stops evolving. And that's just not going to happen. So with me, particularly as a blind person, when we're talking about theaters, you have more and more theaters now that are offering audio description. So I can go to a theater now and enjoy it even more so than others. But as technology evolves, trying to make sure that the access technology I use can access it, trying to create Braille access to building signs, et cetera. As the world evolves, then we're going to have to continue to struggle to evolve and make ourselves relevant. I think it's like a calculus. We're approaching zero, but we'll never really get there, because again, we until we enculturate what our needs into the mainstream progression and innovation of that evolution, we're never really going to be caught up. But it gets a little bit easier to catch up because of so many different factors. So the progress is getting exponentially better, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Quickly to piggyback with Anil, I was going to mention that with sensory disability, there has been progress, especially when it comes to in ways of, is it IT? The AT things are made much easier for individuals. And then we also just need to make sure that the community at large is also knowledgeable about these other resources that can make things much easier. And also knowing how to work them as well, if you're going to have them within your businesses or anything like that, or your companies. It's good to make sure that you too know how to access it and be able to work the assistive technology that's out there.
That's great. And I have one question that came in from our question and answer from Regina Brink, and she asks, do you think fear in revulsion of being disabled contributes to discrimination? Revulsion. I'm sorry, go ahead. Anyone would like to?
I think it's one of the catalysts for discrimination. But I think that we combat that with education. The fear and the revulsion can be there, but if we educate and also give people an opportunity to really get to know people with disabilities, again, echoing how we need to come out of our homes and really interact with the mainstream society. But if it persists after that effort to educate, then that's just blatant discrimination. But I do think that we should have empathy for people that may be frightened out of ignorance or maybe be repulsed out of ignorance, to the point where they can become comfortable with us and recognize that we have capacity and talent, and even more so that we're fun people. We're fun. Yeah.
I just want to add, I'm sorry, go ahead.
This is April. I just wanted to add to that I feel like people with disabilities are a lot more open about ourselves. I'm also a wheelchair user, which I neglected to mention in my intro. And I know that just working with young people today versus when I was younger, I know when I was younger, I held a lot of shame and tried to hide my disability, wearing a lot of long skirts and things like that. And I think part of that was that reaction to, well, I don't want people to think I'm different. But now when I work with young people, I really see that there's an acceptance that that disability is just a part of the human experience. And I think that schools are becoming a lot more open about it. So it gives me a lot of hope to see the young people today embracing that part of their identity and stepping into their power. And it actually gives me a lot of reminders as I age into my disability, as I approach the middle of my 4th decade around the sun, seeing these young people doing that, it makes me want to continue to be loud and proud about who I am as I evolve and my disability changes. And I can't mitigate it the way that I used to, and maybe I don't need to. So thank you.
Thank you. I do have a question that came up in the chat, and I also want to encourage everyone to put your questions and answers in the question and answer section, so that we can also save these for people who view the video afterwards. But this one question, it says, I'm a non-disabled advocate for a young person with a communication and social disability. As children age out of education system, there's a gap in services and difficulty learning to self-advocate, particularly in the workforce. The question is, what is generally available, and where do we need to continue to push to work to help our valuable, intelligent young people gain the rights they are entitled to with the ADA? This is a great question because I'm also a school board member for our local district, and I think this video is even more critical for our young people with disabilities, and that they stand on the shoulders of those before us that actually helped open the doors. And I think being able to understand the ADA, their voices are next to be heard and to be moved forward. There's a lot of gaps in education that still need to be addressed. And I think we as a collective need to look at that as we move forward in regards to our future generation of people with disabilities and how they enter into our society. And I think that's a social responsibility for all to look into.
That was my question, and may I just add, I agree with everything you're saying. The barrier that I've come up against is learning to self-advocate as an adult, as a typical person, or perhaps a person with disability not related to communication and social interaction. That's hard. That's hard for everybody. And when you combine this particular type of disability and layer that on top of the self-advocacy piece, it's very daunting. We can have conversations at home about what we're entitled to and how to advocate for ourselves. But when a person enters the workforce particularly, that's difficult to do at any age for anyone. And so I really feel like you can have someone standing by you being a job coach and helping you, but if you are an intelligent person with a college degree and you're able to function in pretty much every other way, but you have this barrier and you do come against a lot of exclusion as a result of it, what can we do for that? And beyond that, how do we tell our young people, okay, you can keep going, you can go on? I mean, 5%, as I understand it, 5% of people, this could be wrong, but I read it, I felt somewhere back, in special education, only about 5% graduate from college. And so I think there's a lot of people getting discouraged along the way, and we can tell them to advocate or, do this for yourself, but there's a different skill set required for that population. And there is a lot of people in that population now. And we would be really missing out on a lot of skilled workforce if we don't find a way to work through that.
And that's really a great segue to our segregation clipping, which in education, that has also been a big issue. I'm going to go ahead and start that, and then we'll continue our questioning after that. Thank you.
Set apart from the rest or from each other. Isolate or divide. New York City's skyline is lit by a sunrise. Text reads, New York City.
So I was hurt in '89. I think this past October, so it would have been 4 or 5 months before the ADA was passed. So my life has always been the ADA, that it is my right to have equal access to public places in the United States of America, which is a really beautiful thing, and I don't know life without that. I think because I began there, My experience of accessibility has been positive, but also it's still new. I work in the theater, and backstage, a lot of theaters and a lot of stages are not accessible. They are not ADA compliant, which at this point in my career starts to feel annoying because the houses in theaters, the place where people come and see theater, those have all been made accessible, but backstage has not. And a lot of this has to do with the historical significance of the theaters and that they don't want to change them. However, my boyfriend always says, is that a part of history that we really want to hold on to?
Text reads, Washington, D.C. Mark Riccobono, president of the National Federation of the Blind, speaks.
Even 30 years after the Americans with Disabilities Act, there's still a lot of education to do on a regular basis with getting people to understand the normality and basic capacity of people with disabilities. You know, a lot of people just do not have the life experience of knowing a person with a disability, or for that matter, 10, 20, or 100. So understanding the characteristic of disability and how it impacts people's lives is really just not that well known. And as a blind person, even today, a lot of the places I go, most of the people I encounter figure that just because I'm out in that space, I'm gonna need help, that I'm lost, that I must have a need for something. It doesn't matter if I'm wearing a nice suit, traveling confidently, people push, pull, grab me, and otherwise assume that I'm lost. So there's a constant need for education.
People with disabilities still have to prove themselves. General society, especially with people like me who have a disability like mine, don't expect much from us. In fact, they're pleasantly surprised that I can speak and speak coherently.
Parker Glick, grassroots activist, speaks.
The ADA is basically my rights to access my life. I think without them, I wouldn't be able to go and, go pursue my job, social life, have goals in life. I mean, explore beyond what four walls were my room, just like anyone else. So equal opportunity is kind of what it means to me.
Jordan Hall, mobility coordinator for the Statewide Independent Living Council of Georgia, speaks.
When it came to getting into the workforce after graduating from college, I did 71 job interviews total, and I had several cases where I did not disclose my disability until after I'd completed the phone interview, because then obviously when they see me in person, they would see the chair, and then the goal was to hopefully discuss reasonable accommodations once we had that talk. But some individuals, when I would show up for interviews, wouldn't even let me interview once they saw the chair. They would say, "Surely this must have been a mistake. Are you sure you're the person we spoke with on the phone? Are you sure this is your resume?" And, I would have to say, yes, this is me. The resume is mine.
I mean, I had a representative from California tell me he didn't care. When somebody tells you that, it's obviously very disheartening, because you want to believe everybody wants to do the right thing and make life better for everyone in this country. So sometimes you're faced with the fact that not everybody's there. So,
Julie Kegley, attorney for the Georgia Advocacy Office, speaks.
A lot of the legislators that are supportive of raising awareness of people with disabilities is oftentimes because they themselves have a family member with a disability. So then they are the ones getting behind the bill and the legislation that would advance the rights of people with disabilities.
there are so many different types of disabilities that people who have invisible disabilities, for example, may not even know that they're protected under the law. So if you have epilepsy, it's something that one can't see, but an employer potentially could discriminate against you if they know that you have epilepsy, or could not advance you in employment, or could lay you off if you have a seizure, all of which would not be legal, but if you don't know that, you're not going to be able to act on it. So a critical issue for me also is continuing to ensure that disabled people in the United States understand the law, understand the importance of the law and the protections they have.
It's rewarding to see the attitudinal change and the policy change and the physical change and the barriers come down and more opportunities, but we still have a long ways to go. I just go back to that phrase, until there's emotional change, no intellectual persuasion will work. And so what ADAPT and other groups have done is challenge the status quo attitude to get you to feel and think about this emotionally.
Okay, great. Again, I wanted to open this up to our questions to our panelists, and then we'll get questions also from our viewers, our participants out there. So Jordan's Hall experience with discrimination during the job interview highlights a major barrier. What strategies can help improve the hiring process for people with disabilities? And I don't know if Jordan, you want to chime in on that one. As of today, have you seen changes in regards to that process of segregation and employment processing?
If I'm gonna be honest with you, in my experience, I have done later interviews and it still seems to be a barrier. But I would also say that some of the reasons that I feel like I'm coming up against the barrier so often is because the disability will always be a part of me. I am a person with a disability and it shapes who I am, but it does not define who I am. And so for me, something that has been, first of all, I work for the SILCGA. Everyone in our office has a disability of some sort. So I'm consistently engaged with members of my community. That in itself has empowered me so much since finding and obtaining the position. In that same regard, because I feel so empowered from the community that I've been able to be fully integrated in, I want us individuals with disabilities to be in the mainstream of society where they don't have to work for an organization that necessarily specifically hires individuals with disabilities. But I'm going back to the question that was originally posed at the end before we started the segment for what do we do for people that it's just not that easy to educate them that way. I would say sincerely reach out to your Center for Independent Living in the county that you are living in, because one of our core services is employment. And when you are on the job search for with the seal, they're automatically gonna be looking at organizations that they know are willing and able to accommodate. There's also vocational rehabilitation programs where, say, for example, an accommodation was needed, but the person didn't know how to communicate that. The vocational rehabilitation counselor can come in and say, okay, this is the accommodation they need. This is something that would need to be done, and they can even assist potentially in providing funding for that. So I think there's also all kinds of job boards that are geared specifically for individuals with disabilities. and career fairs specifically for individuals with disabilities. But I would just say like too, like I said, if I aspire to be in a mainstream career role that is not specifically with employment for individuals with disabilities, I've got to continue to put myself out there. And I'm not gonna lie, it can be very disheartening when you know that you're being seen for one thing versus the facet of the whole person. But I would just say, keep pushing, because the only way for people's mindset to change is if they gain exposure to individuals with disabilities. You know, if you're the first person with a disability that these people are interviewing, you're their first example of, okay, this person has to live their life completely different from what I know. And it can be daunting for anyone. I mean, even just all of us that are on the panel. For me, my condition, cerebral palsy. Cerebral palsy is such a broad category of a diagnosis. It's a spectrum. That's the same with most disabilities. So it's about humanizing the experience and getting these employers to realize that we have more in common than we are different.
Thank you.
If I may, and I'll be brief for the sake of getting through the rest of what we want to try to do. With decades of experience helping people with disabilities find jobs related to the ADA helped and it also hurt. You know, it before the ADA, we didn't have quote unquote the right, but once the ADA was passed, it made employers aware that they had the responsibility or the mandate, but it also, because of the litigation, made them a little even more wary in some instances to hire people with disabilities. I think that the key, and that Jordan was touching on it, and I think the answer to the question previously is we got to focus on, even if you're an ally, getting the individual with the disability to have a really good positive concept of themselves as a person with a disability and learn those skills that are going to make it possible for them to blend into society and be respected for the value that they bring to the table. We have to cast away the perception that it's easy and that it's fair. And it's not easy for most people, and it's not fair for most people. So we have to dispel ourselves of the illusion that it's easy and it should be fair. And I think that will diminish a little bit more of the frustration. The last piece I would offer is in moving forward, specifically related to employment. There was someone that mentioned, you know, disclosure. I think we have enjoyed in the video, and we have to find ways. There's no ABC of how to disclose the disability. You have to find that marriage between how comfortable are you talking to others about your disability, and you disclose in a way that exploits, you know, your talent and your strengths, and in a way that makes a potential employer be comfortable hiring you. Again, we have to empower the individual with a disability to take charge, even in the instance of vocational rehabilitation or any other peripheral. It's got to be led by people with disabilities, and that individual has to acquire that skill set. And the benefit, I'll close with this, is as you go through that process, as frustrating as it may be, you in that process acquire a skill set that makes you even more marketable, because we've been telling employers we live our lives every day in a world that's not made for us. We have to problem solve and develop strategies every day just to be able to interact. Don't you want that skill set on your team?
Absolutely. And you brought up some great points, both you and Jordan. I'd like to open up to our other panelists if they like to add anything before moving on.
This is April. I think, you know, I have the position where I'm a hiring manager and I'm also a person with a disability. And one of the things that I've tried to do as a hiring manager is look at our duty statements in all the places that I've worked, because sometimes duty statements can have, and a lot of times it's unintentional, but it has a discriminatory effect. Like, for example, things like, you know, must have a reliable vehicle to get to and from work. But if the person is a person who can't drive, if they're a blind person or something like that, but they're still qualified to do all the essential functions of the job. Why do they need to have a driver's license? As long as they have a reliable way of getting to work, why does that matter? And so looking at the duty statements, another one that I think weeds a lot of people with disabilities out is, must be able to lift 25 to 30 pounds or 50 pounds. And I'm thinking, okay, the heaviest thing in my office is a paper clip. Why would I put that in here, And so I think as employers, we can really be allies and say, let's look at our duty statements. Let's also make sure that we're recruiting, hosting recruiting events like with Centers for Independent Living, or making sure that we're working with our state's Department of Rehabilitation to make sure that we're recruiting qualified candidates with disabilities, and just being open to the fact that people with disabilities should be hired in our offices and in our careers. I also think the other thing that I was thinking about that often happens with employers is that sometimes what will happen is that the reasonable accommodation process, while it's true that the onus is on the person with the disability to disclose their disability to access those rights, the hiring manager and the HR department in those companies, it's supposed to be a partnership between the person asking for the accommodation, the hiring manager, and the HR department. And one of the barriers that I see that's unnecessary is a lot of HR departments are so far focused on risk aversion that they don't realize that a reasonable accommodation can also be a DEIA strategy, a strategy to diversify your company, and that the intent of the law is to be less bureaucratic. So I think that hiring managers can really think about, how can I make sure that my duty statement and my HR process for requesting accommodations and my recruitment strategies are centered around building talent and not building barriers for people with disabilities to join the workforce.
Right. Those are excellent points, and that leads us to our next segue for integration, this is what we really are looking for. So here we go.
Text reads, Integration, the intermixing of people or groups previously segregated.
So the ADA was passed in 1990, and in 1999, the United States Supreme Court issued the Olmstead decision, which basically says that people with disabilities have the right to receive services in the community. So in that specific case, it was two women who were in State High Georgia who wanted to move out. And the United States Supreme Court agreed with them that they should move out into the community. And the beautiful thing about Olmstead is that we've been able to expand that interpretation to include other areas of life, such as employment. So thankfully there are some pending bills in Congress that would phase out the use of 14C, so that people with disabilities can make at least minimum wage or greater, and that they can work in an integrated setting alongside their peers without disabilities.
The steps outside of the National Portrait Gallery are painted with an image of Ed Roberts, and a quote that reads, "We, who are considered the weakest, the most helpless people in our society, are the strongest, and will not tolerate segregation, will not tolerate a society which sees us as less than whole people." Footage shows Anil Lewis, Executive Director of the National Federation of the Blind, instructing a blind driving student. He speaks.
So interestingly enough, when the Americans with Disabilities Act passed, that was actually when I lost my sight and became blind. So prior to that, I had the rights of every other American citizen. But once I became a person with a disability, I lost all of those rights. Not legitimately, but just in the perception of society. So the ADA's passage at the time was very helpful in getting me to understand that I still had those rights, but also, even more importantly, getting society to understand that I had those rights.
I am somebody that rolls around like a chicken with their head cut off, that wants to help people more than anything in the world. And to me, it could be an individual that is up walking around, or it could be individuals just like me. I just want to offer them support. I want to know that my life helped make a difference in the smallest way for others.
Meeting somebody, I want somebody to know off the bat that I'm literally just like them. That I've got things that I don't want to share with every other person in the world. I've got a life beyond that one interaction that we've made, and I'm the one that's in control of it.
Integration is where creativity comes into play. And that's where I feel like there isn't enough dialogue happening. Because the truth is, integration comes from experience. It comes from existing with people with disabilities and realizing there's actually not that many differences. There are here and there with just physical vocabulary and needs, but one of my missions is to create more integration. And integration that doesn't need to be a special event, that the integration just exists, that people with disabilities can be in a dance class with people who are able-bodied, and there not need to be a disclaimer or an explanation, that we just exist together. Because to me, that's when we progress.
Or images of disabled people read exclusion, segregation, integration, and inclusion.
I think I can stay us in each of those categories now. There's still segregation going on, big time. The fact that we have people in institutions, that's segregation. Integration, yeah, we have that. Inclusion, yeah, we have that. But it's not 100%.
Okay. All right, so I think that was a really great part in understanding is how can we encourage more natural, everyday integration between people with disabilities and able-bodied people? And I pose that question to anyone in our panel who'd like to start first.
Well, I'll offer, Mark Johnson said it earlier in part of his recording, it was just in passing, but I think we need to add more emphasis to it than we do. The attitudes that society has about people with disabilities is the biggest barrier. If people had, positive attitudes about people with disabilities, it would be a little bit more seamless to have us be a part of the lives that they live. And the attitudes, I can't say it's just on the non-disabled population. We also have to work on changing the attitudes of people with disabilities. When I went blind in 1989, I didn't have the best attitude about blindness or about myself, so I had to learn to be educated. Again, bringing it back to the ADA, I think that one of the things that I've seen, excuse me, in the context of the evolution I was talking about earlier is working with people with disabilities in those early 90s. I was dealing with the generation of people who came through their lives not feeling that they had that right, at least supported through law, and felt that they had to settle for some of the things that were offered. Sure, there were those who really strived to have full participation in society. Otherwise, we wouldn't have had the passage of the ADA. But what I see now, and it's really kind of frustrating to me, but it's a wonderful kind of frustrating, is the young people I work with today, the generation that I'm working with today, they come in with an entitlement attitude. They have the expectation of accessibility. And that expectation leads them to a degree of gravitas that really forces systems to become more accessible. So I think that's the thing that gives me hope. I tried very hard not to push them back and try to support them as they move forward. But it is really interesting seeing that whole dynamic of energy and attitudes change. So it's no longer, we should get in where we fit in. It's more we demand to be equal. So I love that.
I have to agree with you there. Any other? Go ahead.
Speaking to that,
Uh,
I know that a lot of us that know our rights can be aggressive, but what I have found in my experience is lead with compassion. If I lead with compassion and I go into something with the mindset that if people are given the opportunity to know what my needs are, or they physically see me experience a barrier and they get to know me, they're gonna want me a part of their community. They're gonna want me to be a part of that. And so part of my responsibility as an individual with a disability needs to be having a posture of receptivity and being willing to answer questions, not necessarily feeling entitled, but giving people the ability to ask questions and to have collaboration versus like demands. I want to collaborate. I want somebody to see what my experience is and then see, okay, well, this isn't accessible. For example, I've been going to my church for 4 years now, and they reached out to me and they started an accessibility committee for the church because they wanted to make sure that individuals with disabilities are able to fully participate as much as possible. And all the barriers that I face has become so real to that congregation because they witnessed me going through it. When they witnessed me using my transportation to get to and from, they're right there with me in the struggle. So I think getting yourselves out there to be seen and leading with that humanistic posture is really important.
Absolutely. And I'm going to put a question out, but I also want to, in due of time, just to show up the final part of our video in regards to universal design. But I want to put out the question is, what is the difference of integration and inclusion? So think about that as we're wrapping this up, and we'll get some feedback from you. So here we go.
Text reads, inclusion, to make part of, a whole, or set.
Our vision is that we have a world that's inclusive and that people with disabilities can live their lives with the same level of control over their lives and the same level of inclusion that someone without a disability does. So that's what the perfect world would look like to us, is having everybody included and they can live the same lives as everybody else does and have the same level of control over their lives.
Jimmy Peterson speaks in sign language.
With the ADA, telecommunications is one of several titles that I am thrilled was passed into law so that I can have relay service to make my own calls, while in the past, my parents had to walk to the neighbors to make personal calls.
Society's ignorance around the capacity of people with disabilities continues to be the biggest barrier that I, as a person with a disability, face. As a member of the National Federation of the Blind, I learned some basic techniques that I can cope with public attitudes and blend into society. But again, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, I tell people it's really definitive because it talks about how Americans with disabilities act. And in that piece of legislation, we act just like everyone else when given the proper training and opportunity. If the education environments are there and employment opportunities are there and the ability to just enjoy life is there for us, we act just like every other citizen. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, with respect to the messaging around it, in addition to the legislation, helps us overcome those particular barriers.
Andrea Alston speaks in sign language.
My personal experience is that many times I requested interpreters for appointments, and I was frustrated when I showed up without interpreters. I would love to see all businesses that provide services for the deaf and hard of hearing people to be aware of providing interpreting needs.
Text reads, Universal design, the design of buildings, products, or environments to make them accessible to all people, regardless of age, disability, or other factors.
Universal design sounds really exciting and cool, and I just imagine beautiful architects making ramps that look like art, accessibility being right at your fingertips, there being more apps that give you education and give you resources. I still can't believe there isn't an app to rent ramps. Like, we can tap an app and get someone to come to our house within an hour and like give us like a makeover. But like, why can't I rent a ramp if I'm going on vacation? Why can't I rent a wheelchair accessible trailer to do this TV show that I'm doing? There's one accessible trailer in all of Los Angeles. What? Universal design. It is creating more beautiful things that are not just wheelchair accessible. They are accessible to all. And it's not a special thing to be making it wheelchair accessible. It just is. That is a part of the design of it all.
If you take a room of 100 people and you go, okay, how many of you would like to own a home that you could resell to anybody? And all the hands go. How many of you would like to own a home that anybody could visit? And all the hands go. You know, how many would like to own a home where if something happened like it did to me 48 years ago, you would have to spend a lot of money renovating? And how many would like to live in a home where you could age in place? And all the hands go. And you go, how many live in that kind of home? That makes you think about, well, I might not be in that kind of home now, but you know, the next one's gonna embrace that universal concept and create the opportunities for us to come together, have relationships, challenge each other, and move forward.
To be included in society as a whole means that I am part of a complex whole picture, that I'm not being singled out because I'm different. And each individual is different in his or her own way, but I think it takes a special person, especially those of us with disabilities, to get the word out, to get the message out that we are just as capable of producing, of performing, of singing or writing or anything productive. We're just as capable of doing it as the average person. It just might take us a little longer, and that's the sensitivity of the issue, is that society as a whole has to be sensitive to the needs of people that are different. But we don't want to be excluded. We want to be a part of the whole picture.
One of the valuable parts of the work that's going on within the disability community is I don't look at it so much as passing a torch, because to me, passing a torch is potentially separating people from others. I think we need more torches. People need to be holding their torches high. Now that I'm going to be 72 years old, my work, not just in the disability community, but also in the aging community where many disabled people live and many people who are becoming older are acquiring disabilities. They have no idea what the ADA or other laws are. They're not going out and using these laws to protect their rights. So to me, it's multiply the torches, let millions of people be carrying them, and recognize that we're an intergenerational movement. We should be proud about it. We're different than many other movements because of the diversity within our movement, and we should advance that.
So it's really important that we continue to have vibrant organizations of people with disabilities, that we continue to collaborate and share our perspectives, and that we come to that place where we can collectively work. After 30 years of the Americans with Disabilities Act, very strong, forward-looking organizations of people with disabilities that can coordinate work is really going to be the thing that is going to make sure that we achieve all that we had hoped to with the Americans with Disabilities Act and beyond.
What does it feel like when the heavens open up and everything is perfect and beautiful? It comes from a world being accessible and a world that doesn't feel like I gotta problem solve all the time. But it really comes from me, from within. It comes from being in a place of being in full acceptance of who I am and what I have been given and the challenges that I have been handed in this lifetime. And I know that this is what I was meant to do.
Nothing is really handed to a physically challenged or person or a mentally challenged person. We have to work for whatever we get. And the benefit is that people need to see us in the fight. They need to see us putting forth an effort and not.
I very much believe that implementation of civil rights legislation really only effectively occurs when all people who are adversely impacted by discrimination learn about the kinds of discrimination we're experiencing, learn from each other so that we can speak about the adverse effect of discrimination on multiple levels with multiple groups of people, and that we are really seen as a community of one with various forms of diversity.
In terms of disability, first of all, I think that people hear a diagnosis or they see a feature such as a chair and they immediately go to the worst case scenario. They immediately make assumptions about what a person with a disability's life is ultimately based on that diagnosis. And that's not accurate. We need to change that narrative. The ADA is a great start to that, but we also want to make sure that the ADA isn't just something that is heard and regulated, but it actually is implemented in a way that persons' perceptions change as well. People's perception of my disability limits me more than they believe my disability ever could.
If you aren't willing to go out to the same bus stop to me and saying, that bus, we both need to be able to get on. You know, that takes kind of you looking at, how do I feel about it? What do I think about it? Well, don't they have those vehicles that pick you up? No, that's a special, that's separate. Haven't we learned, that separate is not equal? And so part of the message during that, both the march and the crawl and the occupation of the Capitol was, you may think we are special, but the reality is we just want to be treated like everybody else.
Our goal is to have 100% inclusion and 100% integration. We're not there yet, but we're gonna get there. And when we get there, I think it would be that we wouldn't even be having this conversation.
We need society also to change attitude. A lot of people don't see why, and the only thing I can tell them is take away your freedom, take away your ability to come and go like you want to, take away your ability to go out to dinner with friends, to have lovers if you want, whatever. Take away that, put you in an institution and see how you would like it.
Footage shows Parker Glick testing voting devices for accessibility.
I try to let folks understand that what we're fighting for as far as rights and our livelihoods is for every other person as well. It's every single person here, living. As long as you're breathing and everything, you will experience a disability at some point. And if we don't continue to work together with that, then it is going to look like a very focused narrative and very selfish kind of thing. But if we can shift that mindset, then I feel like we can work a lot better, and understanding that we are human. Just because we have disabilities, it doesn't mean that we don't have desires, we don't have goals. That's the complete opposite. In fact, we probably have even more goals. But, I know for a fact it takes a lot more energy and time to pursue those goals and achieve them. But if we weren't so separated, then it probably wouldn't take that much time.
I think when you look at the disabled community at large, it's so easy to see that there are smaller groups based on disability and based on needs. Being disabled doesn't mean that you have the same needs, and even having the same disability doesn't mean that you have the same needs. However, I think the only way to really make this movement, this change, this law work is to come together as a community and to have respect for what each other is fighting for, and then realize that when you boil it down, we're all fighting for the same thing.
Credits roll. Direct.
That was our final segment, and I know we're short on time or a little bit over time, but I do want to open it up to our panel for final thoughts and discussion on universal design, as well as what we just finished off on in inclusion. So how can communities, public spaces, business, schools, and local governments work together to reduce barriers and improve access for people with disabilities? So I'm going to open it up for our panel. Just a quick, your thoughts immediately when you first see that.
Well, I'll offer really quickly. It's got to happen with us, and that's what universal design does. I love what Mark Johnson said about all hands go up with all the questions. If it's universally designed, it's not something special for us. It's something that benefits everyone. But to sum it up, to answer your question about inclusion, there's an old statement of, at a party, if you're getting invited, that's one thing, but you're not really included unless you're invited to dance at the party. But to my reference earlier, I'm so glad that this younger generation is not even waiting on the invitation. They're crashing the party and they're going straight to the dance floor. So I think they were going to get closer and closer, as I said earlier.
Great. Thank you, Anil.
For
Shelly?
me,
Go ahead, Jordan.
so sorry. For me, I think it's as simple as making sure that individuals with disabilities have a seat at the table in various categories of disability in the planning stages. That way, instead of going back and having to modify, you start with accessibility first.
Absolutely.
Just quickly, I know time is far spent. But
Yes.
it's completely being intentional. It's unfortunate that, especially when legislation is being considered, that is either someone who has directly or indirectly been affected, that they will start to look at some of the resources that are needed for the disability community. But before it even gets to that point, just to be intentional, taking yourself and getting away from yourself and stepping into someone else's shoes, being aware of what and who is around us, but seeing how we can just make it better. So if you are intentional and really want to know, it's a simple thing, ATP, ask the person. And as Jordan said, to make sure that everybody has a seat at the table. That diversity only makes your organization, your company, and yourself even better. Being intentional.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I know we're running tight on time, and I want to be respectful of our interpreters and captioners. And so just with a final note, I want to say that the ADA sets the foundation for inclusion, but it's the social responsibility for each one of us as a collective to nurture and strengthen its mission and vision, of equality through training legislation so that we can motivate our younger generation as we move forward. And I want to thank everyone who participated today for driving progress to ADA evolution and inclusion. It's been an incredible experience sharing inclusion, the story of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and hearing the reflections of our panelists. Thank you again to Shelly Simmons, Anna Lewis, Jordan Hall. I'm sorry we didn't have Parker Click, but also April Dawson Rawlings for offering their insight, expertise, and their personal stories through their work. We're reminded that the impact of the ADA has had an ongoing journey toward creating a more inclusive and accessible society for all. We hope today's conversation inspired you to think and how each one of us can contribute in advancing accessibility and inclusion, whether in the workplace, communities, or personal lives. On behalf of the California Commission on Disability Access and the Statewide Independent Living Council of Georgia, thank you again for joining us. It's been an honor, and may the force be with you. Power on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.